And I just want to thank everyone for participating today in this workshop with Sempra companies. And I would like you to know that we are making a recording of today's workshop. So that will be available on our Safety Policy Division webpage at the Commission's website within a day or two after today. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Joe of the Sempra team. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it. Again, I think by now most of you may recognize my voice and my face. I am Joe McCauley, the lead case manager for SDG&E and SoCalGas's 2021 ramp. Today is our 5th of 5 scheduled workshops. I think it might be our 7th, maybe 8th overall post-filing workshop, but it's the 5th in a series of 5 that was scheduled a couple of weeks back. Today, the agenda, there we go. Today's agenda is to have a discussion with SoCalGas's Integrity Management Programs team. Again, when I sent out the FYIs of the workshops, the very first row there reflects 1 to 3 o'clock today, SoCalGas's medium pressure, high pressure, and storage integrity management program. And then to the extent there are follow-up questions from the previous workshops that we might be able to have some clarity on today, we can certainly have those as well. Again, a lot of this is a repeat from what I had mentioned with the other 4 workshops. We had asked parties to identify topics that they would like to have discussions on. Specific to today, Cal Advocates had identified 2 topics, if you will, 2 discussion points. One being to discuss how pipeline segment risk analysis was used to assess, target, and prioritize pipeline risk mitigations, and then also discuss the process for determining the allocation and level of forecasted funding request dollars across the different distributed integrity management program, the DIMP mitigations. Vintage plastic, bare steel, gas infrastructure, and sewer lateral inspections.
Whatever the answer to that question is,
I think we want to make sure everyone's on mute. Thank you. And then, Chris, you will notice there's a little blue text in here. Again, I mentioned this, I think, on some of the other workshops. When you ask about allocation or level of funding, we interpret the word funding to reflect dollars that were authorized in the GRC. And since we're talking about ramp, which is where we are identifying dollars that we anticipate requesting in our GRC application, that's why I added the words that are in blue, just FYI. I think I'm still capturing the intent of your request, but I just wanted to let you know what the blue colored words mean. Again, to the extent we have dollars, forecast dollars in ramp that we anticipate requesting funding for in the GRC. So that's why.
Thank you.
Those were, all right, thanks. And that is it from a intro standpoint. I think each one's gotten a little shorter. I was checking the attendance. We have our integrity management team on the call. I can introduce, I think initially it's going to be Travis and Mark will be the initial speakers. The idea, as was suggested early on, is not to have a presentation. We've had a couple of workshops where some questions came up and we mentioned we would be going over those in more detail at a particular workshop. That's the purpose of today's workshop. So it's really Mark and Travis, I think, are going to give an initial overview, and then it's really going to be open for questions. So before we continue, are there any questions from the folks on the call? I'm not able to see hands up. I mean, there may be just the way my window's open. So if not, Travis, did you want to get started, or was Mark gonna lead off?
Sure. Let me make sure you can see and hear me. Joe, can you do both? Yes. Can you see and hear me? Okay, great. And I see Mark. Mark, why don't you just test your audio real quickly? Make sure we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, very good. Okay, great. So good afternoon, everybody. We're glad to be here. You know, we understand that there are some questions regarding the mechanics of how the integrity management program works, and I think we've got the right team assembled to tackle and answer those questions. We have not prepared any sort of a formal introduction or overview. I think in our minds, you know, in our minds, the folks on the other side of this call, you know, have areas of interest that they want to explore. We're more than happy to follow your lead and answer to the best of our ability any questions you have. We want to be helpful. We want to provide enough information that everyone is confident in what we're doing. And so to that end, I think maybe I will just spend a moment just talking about a brief overview of integrity management, very, very brief, just to sort of calibrate everybody's mind. And then we can get into whatever details or questions folks have on the other side of the line. So if you don't mind, I'll just give a brief overview of integrity management. The integrity management programs, of which we have three. We have a transmission integrity management program, a distribution integrity management program, and a storage integrity management program. These are all code mandated programs. These are prescriptive programs. And as such, there's a whole suite of activity, you know, entire departments dedicated to executing and complying with these regulations. And the basic skeletal structure of each integrity management program is essentially the same. I like to think of it as three distinct elements. The first element is knowing your system. And so you might imagine this would be the act of gathering data, researching records, and then using that information to derive an identification of risks or hazards on your system. That leads you to a second phase of work, or a second main element of integrity management, which is an assessment of the system. So this is where you would see an inspection occur. In the storage and in the transmission world, these would physically be actual inspections using the kinds of technologies that are able to assess the pipeline condition. It's a little bit different in the distribution world, and I'll circle back on that in just one moment. And then the final activity would be a set of mitigations. You can imagine once you understand your system, once you inspect it for hazards or threats, that should drive a mitigative action. And so these three basic elements of integrity management are sort of the backbone or the framework that you could expect to see in any integrity management endeavor. I'll make a brief comment about distribution integrity management. It's somewhat unique in that we don't necessarily have the second element. We don't have the assessment or inspection piece. So just imagine, you know, in the transmission world, we have smart pigging technology that we use commonly to assess our pipeline system, and that's really the bread and butter of a lot of our assessment work. In the distribution world, smart pigging technology is not really or necessarily compatible with the medium and low pressure system. So in the distribution world, you move from system knowledge sort of straight to the mitigation phase of work, and we don't quite have the assessment portion like you would see for transmission or storage. So that's the brief overview. I just wanted to sort of lay that out there so we all have a common understanding of the life cycle of integrity management. I wanted to make that brief mention about distribution being a little bit unique in that we don't necessarily have step 2. We sort of move from step 1, which is system knowledge, to step 3, which is a mitigative action. And lastly, I just wanted to say that we're here to go ahead and jump into any questions or comments that the group may have, and we'll do our best to highlight and illuminate the good work that we feel we do on the integrity management side of the house.
Well, this is Tom Long from Turn. I'd like to start by focusing on one of the main topics for this workshop, which is to ask you to just give us an overview explanation of the mileage that of how the, I guess mostly it's both Semper utilities, I should say, decided on the mileage for your for your medium pressure risk programs, in particular, the pipeline replacement programs, the bare steel and the vintage plastic programs, how did you decide on those mileages, and how did you use prioritization and a risk analysis to do that?
Okay, so I think so I should have taken a moment to sort of introduce myself too. So I'm the Director of Integrity Management. I'm over the transmission and distribution programs, and I have Mark Forrester with me. He is specifically over the management of our distribution integrity management program. So Mr. Long, I think we'll have Mark probably tackle that question for you, and then he and I will go back and forth as we see fit to try to make sure we get your question covered. So Mark, are you you want to tackle that one for Mr. Long?
Yeah, so I can answer that question. So the amount of miles we're proposing is based on both internal and external information, right? So there are multiple industry drivers that help us to come to the conclusion, and these drivers, or these I could call them industry drivers, but they're really authorities in the industry. PHMSA, there's ADBs by PHMSA. I'm particularly talking about the outlay material, which is part of our VIP program, VIPP, Vintage Integrity Plan. ADBs identified the outlay having been overrated for their strength and the propensity to crack. And also there was a CPUC report issued in 2014 that also talked about very similar concerns with that material. And then that's in addition to our risk analytics. And so based on, the concerns documented by the industry, by both our authorities and by other industry players, we believe what we're proposing is reasonable at addressing the number of miles that we have in our system. And you last time we spoke, we gave some miles. I think it was 24,000 miles. That's San Diego and SoCalGas of mains and services that are in our system of this outlay material. So, do you have any questions about that? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah,
I think you are.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have some follow-up questions. I'd like a little more specifics about how you made the decision. Let's start with the vintage plastic program, since that's what you were focusing on. So as I understand it, for the 3-year period that you're modeling in your ramp, you're planning to do 300 miles or so of plastic pipe replacement. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so about 100 miles a year. So how did you decide that 100 miles was the right amount?
Well, like I said, we base it off of some of the industry advisories that we received, and we took into consideration, how many miles that we have of it. If you look at our risk analytics and how we prioritize our pipelines, I mean, we're not proposing to replace pipelines that we feel aren't high risk. I mean, we're identifying pipelines that we believe are higher risk, and it is a very small percentage of our total inventory.
Yeah, because you were saying you still have 24,000 miles of plastic pipe that arguably is I think you're saying it's the outlay pipe.
Yeah.
Right.
More susceptible to failure.
Yeah. But you're
Mark,
not 500 miles or 2,000 miles you're proposing, or you're not proposing 50 miles. So somehow you came to the number 100 miles per year.
Well, we do take into account our historical replacement rates that we've had, and we're projecting out a fairly modest increase, year-over-year increase. So there is an upper bounds in terms of how much we can replace, because just available resources. This does impact our customers, and it does impact the cities and our ability to get permits and things like that. So based off internal and external resources, the rate of increase that we're proposing is what we think we can reasonably do.
Okay, so I think that's the answer to my question. You're doing as much as you think you can given resource constraints. It's not based on a risk analysis to decide we're going to do 100 miles because those are the riskiest ones, and we should stop at 100 because after that the risk reduction returns are not sufficient to justify the work. That's not the analysis you're doing. You prioritize the work, but you're deciding the 100 miles is decided based on how much you're capable of doing.
Right, and then there's also we consider those industry advisories, and like in our last authorization for our rate case, there was a comment put in there. It appears that our current replacement rate is not on pace with its original assessment. So we feel there is definitely support, and there's definitely justification based off documentation, industry information for these increases. And like you'd said, we're replacing at a rate we think we can reasonably increase year over year.
Okay, so let's remember we're in an environment where the commission, since these all delay studies have been done, et cetera, we're in an environment where the commission has a policy of decarbonization, and we're trying to transition to an all-electric system, and we should be thoughtful about putting in new pipes that are have a 60-year service life when that pipe could be stranded. That's just the backdrop that I think is an indisputable backdrop that we're dealing with, which may not be what the people were thinking about 5 or 10 years ago. So given that backdrop, let's think about helping what we need to have in front of the commission to help the commission make a decision about whether 100 miles is right, whether 50 miles is right, whether something in between, or whether more mileage is right. Let's say the commission were wanting to know the risk on a sort of, I'm going to use the word tranche, on a tranche by tranche basis, what the risk reduction you would be achieving based on tranches that are with homogeneous risk characteristics. Is there something you can point to that shows us what the tranches are based on homogeneous risk characteristics, so the commission can decide whether 100 is right or whether something less is right or something more is needed?
This is Elliot. Just want to chime in real quick. Elliot Henry for SoCalGas and SDG&E. I don't know that that's a accurate or complete hypothetical, and I don't know that that backdrop is correctly stated either, that it's not that electrification for the entire state is not what the policy is of the state, and decarbonization is, but I don't think that I think this is a strange hypothetical. I think maybe you want to word it a little differently, Tom, because I think you have maybe a more succinct question than what came out there.
Elliot, I don't think this is a cross-examination. This is a workshop, and in any event, I just wanted to I think it's indisputable that we have a policy of decarbonization. You may disagree, and you represent SoCalGas, which is a gas company, and it's not. You're going to try to have a different way of putting things. But let's put that aside. Let's put that entirely aside. My question is: suppose the commission is interested in knowing the risk reduction of the work that SoCalGas or SDG&E is proposing to do to replace plastic pipe, and wants to know it on a granular basis, so that it can decide whether the scope that you're proposing is the right scope, or whether something less or something more is appropriate. What can you point to help us that's in your RAMP report to help the commission make that judgment?
Mr. Long, you're asking, let me just make sure we got the question correctly from you. You're asking what can we point to in our RAMP submittal that could help the commission decide on, for lack of a better word, the right amount of mitigation? Is that?
They wanted. I think one of the goals of RAMP is to understand the trade-offs and the cost effectiveness of mitigation so that the commission can make an informed judgment about what the right scope of programs is. Just because you propose 100 miles doesn't mean that's the right amount of mileage for the commission to adopt. The commission, a big point, a purpose of this whole undertaking to do a risk-informed analysis and to have RSEs is for the commission to be able to make judgments which are along the lines of what I've just described. So what can you point us to in your report that shows what the risk reduction is on a more granular basis?
Tom, this is Joe, and I also want to sort of piggyback on what Elliot was saying. Is with regards to the ramp, you are correct that the ramp is the first stage of the GRC, and another purpose of the ramp is to inform the commission and yourself, stakeholders, what we plan on at the time of filing the ramp, what we plan on requesting within the GRC. And so, again, I just want to try to, some of the questions you're asking, again, I think our team is hearing them to be more on a GRC level of question versus the ramp. Whereas we prepared forecast and we, as Mark said, we identified what we thought was feasible to do, and that's what we have in the ramp. And that's what we currently plan on requesting funding for within the GRC. The questions you're asking, at least this is me, they seem to be hypotheticals for different situations that we may not have considered for purposes of ramp. And so again, that's why we're asking you to try to phrase your question a little bit differently so we can answer it in the context of ramp.
Do you have a more granular analysis that shows the risk of parts of your system based on homogeneous risk characteristics, that is similar lore, similar core? Do you have something that breaks that down? I mean, so that could be used for the commission to help understand what the cost effectiveness is as you go, for the first 10 miles, and then after that, certain groups of type that have homogeneous risk characteristics. Do you have something that shows that?
Travis, I mean, as we prepared for ramp, we had our relative risk modeling that allowed us to prioritize and rank our pipeline segments based on what we feel are the higher risk segments. It wasn't based on if you will, a quantitative approach when developing the ramp.
Yeah, let me see if I can take a stab at this. The work done within integrity management is all oriented towards compliance with the code. And what the code drives us to do is to put energy into the mitigation of identified risks on the system, right? Within the integrity management program, there's not necessarily a focus to drive towards what you're describing explicitly, Mr. Long, which is to attempt to try to determine, where is the appropriate amount. The appropriate amount within the distribution integrity management program is the amount needed to eliminate the threat or properly manage the threat. So you're kind of, in my mind, we're getting into a discussion around some of the limitations of relative risk ranking. And one of the inherent issues with relative risk ranking, and I think I understand your question, is it's relative, right? Relative risk ranking is risk compared to another. Right? We only stand the risk of A in comparison to B. And one of the problems is when we risk rank, this ranking adjusts and changes all the time. If I have the deck of cards and I address the highest risk at the top, the entire deck reshuffles, and then the ordering changes. And we've encountered this problem before, which is you have a dynamic system, you have new information coming in, this shuffling is sort of constantly occurring. And how do you, or where do you draw a line to say that, well, this amount is enough and we can all feel comfortable about stopping. I guess I have two responses to that. The first one is that's a difficult thing to do. In my mind, it's one of the inherent difficulties with a relative risk ranking approach. And I guess my second response is that's really not how the distribution integrity management program was built. The distribution integrity management program was built to recognize industry threats and then build specific programs around these threats to address them. And then I guess to just try to be direct, the right amount would be enough to get through the entire listing.
So your ramp report on page 3-24, and this was the basis of a data request. I thought you'd be referring to this. I don't know. I don't know why you're dodging this. It was kind of giving you the opportunity to talk about this, but anyway, I'll quote from the report. Within DIMP, the DREAMS DREAMS tool is used to prioritize risk mitigation on early vintage plastic and steel pipeline segments. The risk algorithm includes pipe attributes, operational conditions, and potential impact on population. The results of the analysis determine appropriate action to address risk for each segment and prioritize replacement investments based on a failure analysis, right? So that's a risk algorithm that you have to prioritize and to assess risk, and it says it includes not just the pipe attributes, but also the potential impact on population. So it sounds like it has analogs to likelihood or lure and consequence or core, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And that's what you're using to decide how to prioritize the work, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So can this be used to inform your ramp and your GRC to help the commission make judgments about the risk reduction on a tranche by tranche basis, on a more granular basis than what you've given us in this ramp report?
I think the answer to that is, could it be? Sure. Is it SoCalGas's exclusive responsibility to determine how much is enough? I don't think so. I think that's a broad question, and that's something that involves many stakeholders, right? How much effort and energy is expended to drive down risk to an appropriate level? It's a broad topic. It's a broad question, and I guess I would just simply say, could you? Sure. Do we have anything explicit in the submittal at this moment to accomplish that? I don't know that I can just directly put my finger on it. I would I don't necessarily agree that we're trying to dodge the question. It's more that we're trying to be careful about understanding the inherent nature of relative risk ranking and how one goes about, determining what an appropriate amount is. I don't know that that's. I can say that that's not necessarily what we have done with the distribution integrity management program the way it's built.
And Tom, this is Jamie. Hi, how's it going?
Hi.
I haven't seen you in a while. I think that you bring up a good point. We are, the requirement for RAMP is to provide RSEs, and that's what we've done. And you can see that in the report. Now, the level of granularity is something that we're looking into. We will kind of look at more data and see if in the rate case, if we're able to provide something a little bit more granular. But that's something we're still exploring at this point.
Okay. Thanks. I'll let other folks ask questions now. Thank you.
This is Charles Feinstein. I'm a consultant for Turn. I have a question about the use of condition. I believe you said that you use condition for the transmission and for the storage parts. but you don't use condition for the distribution parts because you don't have it. Is that correct? Or did I hear you correctly?
I think perhaps let me run back through it and then perhaps I'll clarify. When you say condition, I think what you mean is what I referred to as inspection or assessment. You're referring to just a quick introduction that I provided. Is that right?
Yes. And let me help clarify. I'm thinking of the condition of the pipe segment.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. All right. So let me just take another quick run at it for just one or 2 minutes. I was sort of describing the basic elements of integrity management that you would find within any one of these integrity management programs that we operate: transmission, distribution, and storage. Each operates off of what I would just call like a triad, right? The attainment of system knowledge, an inspection or an assessment of pipe condition, which is probably where you picked up that term, and then a mitigation. And this is easy to follow if we talk about transmission. So at SoCalGas, when I refer to step 2, which is the inspection or the assessment portion of our integrity management work, we rely heavily on smart pigging in order to conduct that assessment of specific pipeline condition. And by that, we really mean discovery of defects and anomalies. That's really what we mean by condition. We are unable to do that similar type of inspection or assessment work in the distribution program. So just as a quick example, the diameters and pressures and physical configuration of the system are such that it prevents a smart pigging program from being implemented. So hopefully that helps out a little bit. So what we do in the distribution integrity management program is we collect an extensive amount of data on the system. We perform risk analytics, and then we use the results of that data collection and risk analytics to directly drive mitigation activities. That would not be the case, for example, with transmission integrity management. Within transmission integrity management, we would do the same data collection activity, do the same risk analytics activity. We would use those results to drive the inspection, which is physically possible on the transmission system. And then we would use the findings of that inspection to then drive mitigation. So hopefully that helps to clarify. It had more to do with inspection and assessment and not necessarily condition.
Well, I think
Hopefully
I
that helps.
saying, and thank you for the clarification. It's the inspection and assessment that's determines, at least to some degree of uncertainty, the actual condition of the pipe segment or the T side. I have 2 questions then. One is, for the T side, do you forecast condition? So you've made an observation. Let me help you define the problem that I'm asking.
Okay.
You've made an observation at some particular time. You know something about the material. You know something about the pipe segment. You know something about the way it's used, the ground that it's in and whatnot. Do you ever forecast the transmission pipe segment's condition, which would tend to guide mitigation activities in the future?
If we're talking about the transmission system, I would not characterize it as forecasting.
Okay.
I think the way I would describe it is we collect information. We use that information to help us identify threats. Kind of different than forecasting. That's where I would say I wouldn't call that forecasting. I would call that responding to the information that's available. We collect information and we respond to it, and we use it to identify threats. And then based on the threats that I've identified, we definitely use that to direct how we conduct our inspection work. So forecast is not how I would say it. I'd say more respond to the information.
Good, that clarifies that. Then let me ask the other question, which has to do with the fact that you don't do that kind of inspection for the distribution pipe segments. My question then is, how do you decide which distribution segments you will attempt to mitigate? One wonders if that's based on the industry advisories that you get or something else? I'd like to know a little bit more about how that specific decision is made.
Yeah, so we do have information about the pipelines, like the manufacturer, the date of installation. We can infer environmental information like soil type, and we can gather some more of that additional information. We have operating pressure. We also have, and those are examples, and not just those things. We also have leak record information too. So we have a pretty extensive history of our leaks repaired, and we capture information such as leak cause, right, and the type of failure, and things like that that we utilize in relation to the pipe information, in relation to the environmental information, and even proximity information for determining, which pipelines are that we believe are at a higher risk than other pipelines. And that's
Thank
kind
you.
of a high, but yeah.
And when you say higher risk, am I correct in saying that you are thinking of a combination of how likely it is for a leak to occur or some other bad event, as well as the consequences of such a bad event should it occur?
Yeah, we've been working off of a relative risk ranking system. So it's not necessarily we're predicting that a leak's going to occur on that pipeline, but we're taking into account that historical information to identify the higher probability that that pipeline is a higher risk of failure. So pipelines that haven't leaked historically would not be necessarily, because we use multiple attributes to determine the result, necessarily be a higher risk. That answer your question?
Almost.
Go for it. Okay, what else? what was
what I'm driving at is whether or not you have the formal machinery in place to write down the probability of the occurrence of a leak, say over the next year, for one of these pipe segments.
So part of what we provided in the data request was a new risk result that we've been working on, and it's a relatively new result, and we've been working pretty hard on it for a while, and it does provide some of those qualities in terms of some likelihood of failure and then consequence of failure. That does give us a little bit more quantitative results to work from. So those are things that we're working on incorporating into our program now. But as far as, when we're preparing for ramp, we did not have those results from that risk analytics at that time. So we definitely are maturing and moving in that direction. But boots on the ground, we haven't implemented those results in our prioritization and planning construction process.
Thank you.
Did I get it? I get the.
I understand what you're saying. Yes, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Turn has been asking a bunch of questions. I had some more, but I didn't want to preempt other folks if they did. At least give them a chance to ask before we dove back in.
This is Chris Parks with Cal Advocates. I'll jump in maybe to ask a couple of questions. I would also be circling back on some of the things that you were mentioning earlier, Tom, from Turn. So, but before I forget to ask, one of the questions that we had on our bullet list was to ask how SoCalGas may use pipeline segment risk analysis to assess, target, and prioritize pipeline risk mitigations. I know that there's, segment risk analysis where it's done on a segment by segment basis. Does SoCalGas do that?
So our system, we do segment our system into into segments that are like material, pipe size, and of the same installation work order. And then our risk results are at that level of granularity in terms of, you know, how we prioritize which pipelines to replace. That those are basically provide us the target areas for where we want to do pipeline replacements. So we don't exclusively replace that given segment in the area because there might be other segments nearby or connected to that segment. So it's not that top-down approach where we do this segment, this segment, this segment, because I mean, if you can imagine going into an area, replacing a segment, and then leaving, going to another segment, another city, and then coming back 3 months later and replacing another one, right? So there's a certain amount of planning and strategy behind when we go to an area, we're going to do as much as we can without overly impacting that community. And so we don't come back again. And then we might come in, do the replacement, and we come back. They could have just done a huge city improvement, and then now we're having a problem getting a permit and things like that too. So we try to be thoughtful about where we go do replacements. But yes, we do have it down to the segment level, and that does allow us to prioritize going into an area, but it may be just more than that one segment when we ultimately do the replacements.
Thank you. And so you mentioned, what were the attributes that you were discussing? You said like material. I was trying to jot down what you were saying.
So we have material, manufacturer, pipe size, and I'm thinking plastic too. So material, pipe size, manufacturer, and then we have a date of installation, and then there's other attributes in regards to where the pipe is located. So, you know, we might have business districts. It might be located in a business district. And then we have the leak history on that pipe segment and those leak causes as well. You know, what actually failed, what were the leak causes? So we take all those factors into consideration as well.
Okay, in the ramp, does it get that granular in the information that's submitted in a ramp?
Now these are our integrity results, and these are the results we use to prioritize our replacements. Not to say that there wasn't information utilized in developing the RSCs, but it's from my, you know, what I can talk to is what we use for integrity management for pipeline prioritization.
Okay, does it get down to like, you know, seam type and that kind of stuff for pipelines?
For distribution, no. I mean, no, not seam type.
How about for transmission?
I can't talk to that.
For transmission, yes, we seam type, just as an example, that would definitely be a factor in how we conduct our risk analysis.
So do you get down to that? Do you do a transmission segment analysis similar to what you were describing for distribution, or how does that work for pipeline segment analysis?
Let me make sure I got your question. You're asking, could you just rephrase it one more time for me, please, and then I'll go ahead and give it a shot.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm familiar with, you know, there's some kind of risk analysis, I guess, approaches. There's, you know, I don't know if you'd call it pipeline segment analysis. We've seen presentations from, I believe, Muehlbauer. Are you familiar with Muehlbauer pipeline segment?
Yes.
And they talk about drafting a spreadsheet that looks at all these different attributes of all the different segments of a pipe to try to understand the risk of each of those segments. And that way, I think that they then get, I don't know if you want to use the word tranche, but put into categories so that understanding which of these attributes have the greater risk, because it gets scored. And that way you add all these attributes up and you get like a total score, you kind of know what the total risk score is for a particular pipeline segment. And then I think you would target, depending upon the cost, addressing those areas. And I understand what Mark was saying before, is that you don't just go in and replace maybe one particular area, you're looking at the big picture. But I'm trying to understand if that's an approach that SoCalGas uses or not.
Got it. Okay, yeah. Let me respond to that. So you definitely have the correct understanding. So is it precisely analogous to how Mullbauer approaches it? No, not exactly, but in broad strokes, absolutely. We collect data. I'll just use your seam type example. That data would include age, diameter, pressure, wall thickness, grade, a lot of the typical pipeline physical attributes, environment, and then one of those physical attributes, like you were mentioning, would be seam type, right? And then if it's a seam type that's susceptible to certain sorts of threats, absolutely that seam type is going to increase the risk score, right? That seam type would be identified as having a higher likelihood of failure, and in turn that would ultimately affect the risk score. And all of that information is processed through a relative risk model, and it produces a result. And then that result, just continuing down the seam threat example, that result would identify that particular seam type as a threat of concern. And when we select an inspection method, when we select an assessment method, we would have to make sure that we are able to detect and address that specific seam threat, in addition to all the other types of threats identified on that system. So I think broadly, you're right. It's similar. You collect data, you use that to identify threats. We evaluate those threats and produce a ranking, and then we use that to drive our assessment methods. I think it's also important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily all assets, it's not necessarily all threats, but primarily when you're talking about pipeline, the way you've described it is accurate.
Thank you. Does the ramp get to that level of granularity when selecting conducting the risk scoring and when conducting the mitigations? Does it get to that granularity in terms of selecting that?
I want to say no, and the reason why is the integrity management programs these are really what I would call like boots on the ground programs, right? The integrity management programs are constructed in a way to actually drive on the ground mitigative work, and because of that, and because they're code mandated programs, there's a certain amount of I'm struggling for the words right now. The process is fairly prescriptive, and the process is really oriented around responding to certain threat types. It's like, I'll give you another quick example, just using your example of the seam type. If I run into a certain type of seam type anomaly, I don't really have a lot of choices about the mitigation. It's mandated. If we run into an immediate repair condition, that must be responded to. There's not a lot of analysis to be done, if that kind of makes sense, right? There's just mandates for how you are to respond to certain types of conditions. And so when we do our work within the integrity management program, or when we do our work within distribution, or we do our work within storage, it's very action oriented. RAMP is recognizing similar conditions as risks, and RAMP is certainly informed by the work we do within these integrity management programs, but RAMP is not the same. And so when it comes to this idea of granularity, I need that granularity, and I want that granularity when we're over here in the integrity management programs, because we're really using it to make decisions about what we're actually going to do in the field. On the RAMP side of the house, that level of granularity doesn't necessarily have the same benefit or utility. I don't need that level of granularity. What I need on the ramp side of the house is more what I would call a broad perspective, right? We're taking similar information, we're using it to inform what we do in ramp, but it's a broad, I would just, for lack of a better way of saying it, like a 20,000 foot view of the world. It's not this boots on the ground, joint by joint of pipe view of the world. So I desire and need granularity on the integrity management side. On the ramp side, rather we move into what I would call a much higher level, a much higher view, a much broader view where the granularity doesn't necessarily play out in the same way.
Got it. Thank you. So kind of tangential a little bit to that topic. What are questions that I think might have been on the first slide, or they were in our previous submission, but it had to do with walking through specific types of, actually, I think these were all DIMP programs, but in one of the earlier workshops, we had a spreadsheet. It was called Final 2021 RSE Work Paper, SCG MP, Supplemental Level 2. And I have a copy of that on my computer. I could pull it up. I don't know if that would be I wanted to reference a couple items on that spreadsheet, which I think are what you were just talking about, Travis, are at the ramp level. And I wanted to bring that up to ask some specific questions. I could maybe just share it off my computer, I suppose. If that's okay, I'll do that, and I can ask those questions. If that's okay with you too, Joe.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's fine. Just FYI, with regards to the work paper itself, I think Jeff Bunting is on the line. He's the one from the quant side. It's the quant team that put together the work papers and did the analytics specific to ramp. And so just it may be a different person answering your questions. Just FYI on that.
Okay, well, the questions kind of feed back to I think what Tom from Turn was talking about earlier in figuring out these different programs in the ramp. But maybe I'll share this one. Let's see if this works, because I highlighted the particular programs and see if this works. I kind of lose track of my display, so hopefully I'll still be able to see some of this. Are you able to see this okay now? Is it large enough?
Definitely not. It's too small for me.
Okay. Is this any better?
Yeah, you're getting within my focal length here.
I can see it.
You can't see it
Okay,
now? Okay.
I'll rely on Mark because he can see it. I think I can make it out. Oh, that looks good. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
There we go.
All right.
So
these programs were on this list that were in our additional comments list that we had sent. But we had talked about DIMP, the DREAMS program, including the bare steel replacement, also the vintage integrity, which I think Tom from Turn was talking about earlier. So if I look at these rows in here in this ramp work paper, it talks about, there's a column that has percent effectiveness, lifetime benefit, total cost. Let's see, I wanted to get over to the RSE. So let's see, am I going to lose anything there? No, I think I can get the big part. If I'm scrolling it on my sheet, I hope you can see the scrolling. So I'm showing the total cost in the RSE per dollar M. And so I think earlier it was being explained that this is used to inform like the parties in the commission, I guess. However, I think what we were looking at was how is this used to decide the level of funding. So what I don't have here, for example, on this spreadsheet for the vintage integrity plastic program is the number of miles. But what it does show is total cost, which I guess is this 657 million, I guess? and an RSE of 1.16. So on the list of these highlighted ones, the RSE is relatively low. The dollar figure is relatively high. I don't have on this spreadsheet what the number of miles are or what the total number of miles are that will eventually would be part of this program over many years. But I think what we might have in common, if it's the same thing that Tern was asking about, is in determining the level of mitigation funding request. I want to use the replacement language that Joe used when he was changing the language that we had used earlier. But the forecast dollars determining the number of miles, because RSE is risk spend efficiency. So it's a method of determining what gets the best risk reduction per buck. And then we see these numbers, and it's not clear. I understand that maybe these are what we would expect to see, I guess, coming out of the ramp going into the GRC from SoCalGas or Sempra. And but what's not evident here is how this level of mitigation is chosen, because even though the RSC is reported here, it doesn't really show the number of miles, how that compares to the number of miles that will eventually need to get done, how this level of mitigation was picked. And I don't know if you have any information that kind of decides that, because at a low RSC, first glance it would be like, oh, well, this has a low RSC. Why so much money in that low ORSC program? But I don't know if that's described in detail, how this level was picked versus a different program or a different level or something like that. Do you have any additional insight into that you can share?
Well, I can talk to. Well, for one, the EPM replacement and installs, that's not a DIMP program, but the drip above is. So I mean, I guess if you shifted up the highlights one row up, that would be the DIMP programs, and then that would give you a view of what integrity management is looking at when we're requesting funding, or when we're identifying what we need or we feel is appropriate for addressing. I can talk to, like, I know when I first saw this, I saw that RSE score of the GIP, and you're like, well, that should we do more, right? But the reality is we can't do more. I'm just talking about boots on the ground, like Travis said. I work with that team a lot, and there aren't resources to do more. I mean, we're doing what we can for that program, and we're expecting to be done in 2027. So it's not like we could shift resources out of, I don't know, BSRP if you take the lowest and put it in. That's not really feasible. So those are a couple of comments. Do you need anything clarified? I can talk to it.
Mark, maybe I can jump in here a little bit too. This is Jeff, by the way. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I think you can, until I'll stop talking. Just more specifically to the RSCs, one of the things I think we have to consider, and I may have mentioned this before, is there are certain components of the RSC that drive that value. And so I know this one you're looking at, we eventually did provide a supplemental work paper, which, Joe, correct me if it went out to all parties. I thought it did, where it talked about exactly what was behind the percentage values. So I caution from looking sort of at this view, and this is kind of what we talked about in our ramp C, kind of the limitations of RSCs. It's not really to go, well, this one has a higher RSC, so we should definitely do it over this one. There's a lot more things that go into that and to that decision as well to whether or not we should do that program. And I'll give you an example. So GIP is so high, and one of the reasons it's so high is because when our methodology where we're looking at the percent, we're attacking a huge portion of the scope. So naturally right there, since you're doing a large amount of the work already, you're seeing a higher increase in the RSC, whereas compared to things like VIP and BSRP, our scope is a lot larger. And I think you were getting to that point So that's why I mentioned the other work papers too, because it talks about total miles and things like that. So in this particular snapshot in time, you're seeing two different programs where one has a high dollar spend and a low scope because you have a lot more miles to address. So that's just one thing to take into consideration when you're looking at these different values. It's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. It's just another piece of information we should use to really decide which programs we're doing.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Jeff. So I think you know, there might be, if there's a time in the today's session, I think it was there. I forgot what the agenda item was, but to talk about additional things, I might circle back to this because what I believe is the intent of RAMP in general is to uncover risks and to prioritize them, and then to authorize or develop a prioritization and a level of funding to address the highest risk to ultimately to prevent failures and especially catastrophic events. I understand, my impression so far is that this is more leaning towards an accounting. This is what is being presented. These are the numbers that we come up with if we run some, you know, formulas on them. This is the RSC. This is what we're doing. It's not coming across as like explaining this is how we got to this level. This is how we got to these miles. And even if this is restricted in some case because of resources, then it would make sense to me that be transparent. You know, if it's because, well, the resources are not presently here in order to address this high RSC mitigation, then it would be helpful to explain, well, why is that not becoming a priority to ramp those resources up to address this high risk uncovering in the ramp. So, but that might be more something to discuss towards the end of the presentation. But I hear what you're saying. I just thought that I heard before that it was, you know, this is to inform us, which is informative because it shows us total costs, it shows us total RSCs. However, I believe that one of the objectives of the ramp was to go through this analysis and use that to drive the programs that are going to be mitigated so that the dollars, the limited ratepayer dollars, are going to be put towards those ones that get the best bang for the buck and ultimately reduce failures and catastrophic events. So, but maybe that's a topic to come back to at the very end. But thank you for explaining to me this these items.
Yeah, you know, if you don't mind, I wanted to just interject one more facet to this discussion, because I think you're bringing up, that's a good discussion. I think your characterization of the approach is very nicely stated and clear. And one thing I was hearing you saying is, you know, are there things we can do to ramp up the effort? Can we put more resources in? And I think that's one element of how these scopes get defined, right? I mean, of course, resources help to define scope, but there's another element to how much we can bite off and safely chew. Maybe I'll just put it that way. Which is the system itself. There's a certain amount of just physical system constraint that's also at play, right? So of course we can devote more resources to an effort, and we can affect a change, and we can create an increase in result, but to a practical limit, right? Just as a quick example, you know, these threats manifest themselves physically in the field. So let's just imagine, for the sake of explanation, let's just imagine a certain neighborhood was built at a certain time, all using the same type of pipe, right? And this is pipe that we consider to be risky, and everybody wants it to be eliminated. You know, there has to be a fair amount of sequencing that occurs when we approach this neighborhood and attempt to mitigate the threat. You simply couldn't walk in there and just wipe it all out overnight. You'd be knocking folks out of service. You'd be choking the system off. There would be physical constraints at play. And so I know it's a somewhat simplistic analogy, but I'm just trying to paint the picture that we could put a 1,000,000-man army onto that. It doesn't necessarily mean we can make it go any faster, because you're going to be hitting another facet of work, that a real practical one, which is just the actual geographic and physical constraints that we have to deal with. So I just wanted to take a minute to sort of add that onto the discussion. I fully appreciate increasing resources, but I think you do hit a point of diminishing returns where we do start running into these kinds of practical limitations. And that's a big part, I think, of the discussion about how we approach the scopes. Your original question was sort of centered around how do we go about defining the scope of work and the amount of effort in each one of these threat categories. And a good chunk of it is dedicated around this idea of the system constraint itself. So there's times where we talk about the need to give our field teams a good amount of latitude, because there's a fair amount of real world, real practical, challenges that they need to work through. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I just wanted to kind of add that on because I thought it would add a little bit of insight into the actual work beyond just the simple idea of resourcing alone.
Well, thank you, Travis. And I think having if that, how the utility draws that line. You mentioned diminishing returns and going into like a large project, but where they draw that line, which then I think determines the number of miles. So why is it drawn here versus how is it drawn there? If there were sort of like more specifics on, well, it's drawn here and it's drawn here because of this right here. So having a little more granularity on that, I think would be helpful, because then otherwise it's like, oh, well, do all the high risk stuff right away and focus on that. If that can then, prevent failures, the greatest risk, safety and reliability to the customers, and deliver that initially at the beginning or something like that. But I hear you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So this is Tom again. Could I ask you to pull up another data request response? If you could do it, I'd appreciate it. It's the spreadsheet results to our data request 11 subparts.
Tom, are you asking me to do it? Do you want me to pull it up?
No. I'm asking Sempra to. No.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this one. Thanks.
They have this. They have the redacted version of it. It needs to be the redacted version.
Tom, for workshop purposes, we don't pull up we provided the redacted version as a spreadsheet, and for workshop purposes, we don't pull up redacted versions of the spreadsheet. We did not convert it to a PDF because it just wasn't viable to provide it as a PDF. But we can talk about it, but sorry about that inconvenience.
Well, I'm going to ask about the column headings on it, and I don't understand what you're saying, Joe. Why you can't? Someone doesn't have this Excel spreadsheet on their screen, and they can't share it with the rest of us, so that everybody else can follow along.
As I mentioned, we typically provide redacted versions in the PDF format. This one's a spreadsheet, so people could read it. If you can ask your question, and we'll see how it goes.
I'll try to see if I can share it then. How do I go? Someone's gonna have to explain to me how we do sharing. You have to give me permission or something, or I don't. And Fred, if you have, you have the unredacted version. I guess that's your problem, but I know you have it. I just want to ask about these headings.
I could share the screen, the Excel sheet. Have request, but if there is some confidentiality issue with that particular version, I suppose that's not a good idea.
Redacted version, that's not the right one to use. I have the redacted version. I just don't know how to share it on my screen.
You should have a share button on the bottom of your view of your screen?
It's grayed out. It's not.
Oh, so maybe can our IT person give Tom privileges to be whatever level he needs to share his screen? I think is Jorge, are you with us today?
Yeah, he should be able to share his screen now. I just made him presenter.
It's still gray.
Give me 1 second. There you go. Do you want to try it now? Because it says that you are presenter. So.
It's still gray. I mean, it says open. System preferences. It's still gray, Jorge. I mean, I know I'm a presenter, but I just don't. It just gets me to something that says open system preferences.
How about now? Is it still gray now?
It just said I'm a co-host, and I clicked on OK, but it's still gray.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why it's not allowing you to share. It should. Is it possible? Is it possible for someone else to possibly share? I'm not entirely sure why it's not allowing you to.
They're called the central utilities. They have the ability. They have.
Yeah, Tom, I'm working on creating one that I can share.
You sent me a redacted thing. Yeah, so just.
All right, hold on a sec. I need to move some things around here. Just a sec. Share. 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 Hold on. Oh shoot. There we go. Is that? Oh, that's the wrong one. Hold on. Let me close that. Let me load this one. Are people able to see me sliding something over?
The screen is black for me.
Okay, hold on. I didn't do it the right way then. Just a second. Sorry about that. We're working on it.
See something.
Just a sec. Just a sec. Yeah, hold on. Sharing, stop sharing. Why is that blank? My share screen is blank and not a extra monitor. Why is that? Never works when you want it to, does it? Share. Screen. Share. You got it's still black, huh?
Nope.
No,
Now
that looks like it's getting there.
Now you see it?
Yeah.
it's small.
Okay, these are the headers.
Great.
Better.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so my question, and so whoever's in charge of this, and if it's you, Joe, thanks for your help on this. What I want to do is ask our panelists from the Semper utilities, which of these relate to the consequence side. I see right now we have column E, business district. I assume that's something that relates to the consequences if there's a failure of one of these pipes.
So
Yeah, I think Mark, were you trying to jump in? I was just gonna say something, but you go ahead if you were gonna tackle.
Go ahead.
I was gonna suggest, Tom, you're wanting let me make sure I got the question right. You're wanting to go through this set of headers and identify which ones are consequence related?
Yeah, because just for background for everybody else, this is the data request response when we asked for the risk algorithm that was referred to on page 3-24 of the SoCalGas ramp report. I read that sentence earlier, and this is what was provided. We asked for the results of that risk algorithm, or it's also called the DREAMS tool. And this is the results, and then we got a redacted version. But this all I'm interested in the heading is the heading, so this is great. And I just want to know, and as I read earlier, it says that the risk algorithm includes pipe attributes, and you see a lot of these headings have to do with pipe attributes and operational conditions like soil type, etc. And it also says the potential impact on population. So I'm wondering, and that we when I asked you earlier, you said that's the consequence side of things. So which of these headings relate to the consequence side is my question.
Okay, I think so. We have a third participant from our team on the call, Mari Shironishi. She's the one in the best position to walk you through the specifics at that level. So I think at this point, I'd ask Mari to step in and help identify the column headings that are consequence related. I think maybe there's some audio issues going on. Okay. So Mari, you're still on mute. We can see your image, we just can't hear your audio. Is the mute function controlled externally? In other words, is the meeting facilitator able to unmute the participant?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go. There you go. Now you're on. Yeah, we can hear you. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so Mr. Long, Mari Shironishi from our team is going to tackle this question for you. So I'll go ahead and mute myself and let her take it.
Mari, did you hear the question, or would you like Tom to repeat it?
Okay. No, I get that. Hold on, I'm getting an echo. Let me just turn this on. So which ones are consequence? Was that the question?
Yes, which of these headings relate to consequence? The language I read earlier said that this reflects population impacts.
Yeah, so the consequence elements are the business district.
Okay, and Mari, could I ask you, I'm sorry to interrupt. On business district, I don't have it. Does it just indicate whether it is or it is not a business district, or does it say something more specific about it?
That's right.
Tom, with regards to what the data states, we really need to be cautious.
No, I'm asking for the nature of the information, not what's in.
I understand. I'm just saying, to the extent Mari feels comfortable answering questions for data that's redacted, I'm just putting that out there to be reminding our team to be cautious.
Okay, so Mari, if you're with that comment, is it just indicating whether it's a business district or not? Is that all? Is that what's indicated?
Yeah, I mean, it takes into the location-specific information. So whether the pipe segments that we're analyzing is in the area. I don't know what else I can provide, but that's the gist of the information.
So are there other headings that relate to consequence?
Yep. The other one would be the pressure, set pressure, column H. And I think you'll have to scroll to the right, Joe, but there should be the column that says distance to building. It might be towards the end.
Yeah,
Column
AR.
Yep.
Can you see that? It's on my screen. Can you see it there?
I can. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, and the one before that was, can we go back to the one you mentioned? I got business district and distance to nearest building. What was the middle one?
Pressure.
Set pressure. And that has to do with the higher the pressure, the more. Well, could you explain how that's consequence related?
Yeah. Sorry, Joe. I was having a little bit of a difficult time with my volume. I got my volume up to be able to hear you. Can you explain one more time what I can and maybe what I'm able to explain or not?
Well, to the extent we identified data as confidential, and on this one, I can't tell because I only captured the headers. I didn't capture which ones were grayed or grayed out. But to the extent Tom is asking, let's say to his business district, I think to his question of, well, is it a yes/no answer? You don't need to tell me if it's yes or no. Is it a yes/no answer, or are you giving a specific district name? That's the type of question. And so he's asking with regards to set pressure, what is it? It's a consequence. And are you able to explain, again, to the extent that data is confidential, are you able to explain what aspect of that data it makes it a consequence?
Yeah.
Tom,
yeah.
I think that's fair, Tom. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even care what the numbers are. I just want to know what is it about set pressure that makes it some consequence related?
Yeah, so the idea is that we will take a look at the pressure and then what that impact will look like on the consequence side.
Okay, and I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just trying to understand what does pressure have to do with the consequence?
Well, so part of that is, I think what Mark and Travis both explained is that we're moved to a non-relative risk model, and the methodologies we used here are to understand what are the chances of the leak is turning into certain type of event, and in a consequence, you can see that we're measuring a serious event. So as part of the process, we input certain data sets that we think that might have a certain relationship to turn maybe increase or some relationship for the leak to turn into serious incident. So we believe the pressure may be one of the relationship that we should look into, including like a business district and a distance. So that's why we use that as an input to understand the relationship of how likely those leaks will turn into a serious incident.
Okay, could you, Joe, could you scroll to the very farthest right of where the columns end? It skips over to the next page on the spreadsheet. So is AU the farthest right column?
I believe so.
Okay, great. So is that column the probability of serious incident per year? Is that sort of the blending of the consequence and the likelihood of components that are reflected on this spreadsheet?
So column AS, as Joe is projecting, is what you call like a likelihood of failure. In this case, what we're looking for is leak. And then consequence is what are the likelihood of those leak turning into a serious incident. And then as a result, that we get that serious incident rate per year, that's your risk results.
Okay, so just to paraphrase, AS is like the likelihood, AT is like the consequence, and AU is the combine of the
risk.
two.
That's right.
Risk score. Okay, that's helpful.
Oh, excuse me, this Chuck. I have to clarify that. AS is a probability. AT is a probability. and AT by its label is a conditional probability. Therefore, the product of AS and AT is the joint probability of a leak and a serious incident, which I believe is what you have in AU. How is it?
It is.
Well, then how is that a consequence? I'm confused.
The consequence is evaluated at the location specific of how likely those leaks will event, right? So we take it into account of like a serious incident where people are potentially be injured or fatality. And then we try to understand what the likelihood those leaks turning into those serious event, because leak itself may have various consequences, but we're really trying to model the safety consequence. And then understanding the chance of those events happening is really the total result, ultimate results of the risk that we're trying to quantify here.
Yes, but I understand what you just said, but AU is a probability. That's got nothing to do with consequence like injuries and deaths and other sorts of things like a fire. That's just the probability of the occurrence of an event.
No, the probability, so the probability of serious events are determined based on the data inputs that we just talked about, and we determine how likely those leak will turn into those serious incidents. But that wouldn't happen if you're not in those like a business or more populated area, and then we use that proxy to indicate what are the seriousness of that event is, right? But so without that piece, you're only left with the probability of leak, and then you don't know how that leak is going, what kind of impact that leak's going to have. So what we're trying to quantify is that impact piece of it as a consequence.
Let me try again.
Chuck, would you mind if I wanted to get to segue to another point, if you don't mind. I'd rather we not dwell on this. Is that all right?
Sure.
Thank you. So I just wanted to add probably the most important element to this discussion that hasn't happened yet, but it's the utilities obligations under the settlement. And I just have to remind everybody of row 14. This is not what we're talking about. Is not whether it's a nice idea or not. It's something that utilities have already agreed to, and it's become a commission decision. And I'll read the relevant language, row 14 of the settlement. For each risk event, the utility will subdivide the group of assets or the system associated with the risk into tranches. Risk reductions from mitigations and risk spend efficiencies will be determined at the tranche level, which gives a more granular view of how mitigations will reduce risk. The determination of tranches will be based on how the risks and assets are managed by each utility. That's what we're looking at this spreadsheet. This is how the utility manages them. Data availability, well, lots of data available. Look at the spreadsheet. Model maturity, and strive to achieve as deep a level of granularity as reasonably possible. Obviously, quite a lot of granularity is possible, as we can see. The rationale for the determination of tranches or for a utility's judgment that no tranches are appropriate for a given risk event will be presented in the utility's RAMP submission. I didn't see any discussion of that in the RAMP submission. For the purposes of the risk analysis, each element, i.e. asset or system, contained in the identified tranche would be considered to have homogeneous risk profiles, i.e. considered to have the same lore and core. So this is not a debate. This is not an issue for debate. This is not what's a good idea or not. This is what the settlement requires. Mari, this is not directed at you, and this is just a comment. I'm not asking for a comment back from Sempra, but I just don't want us to lose sight of that. The earlier discussion was like, well, we should talk about what's a good idea or not. No, we should talk about what the settlement requires. And the intern's view, the Sempra is there's an abject failure to comply with the requirements of the settlement. That's my comment for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Any other questions then on the spreadsheet from Tom or other parties?
None from me, thanks.
Appreciate it. Chris?
No, I have nothing on this spreadsheet.
All right.
This is Melinda from Protect Our Communities. So I don't have anything on the spreadsheet, but I had a couple more, couple other questions.
Go ahead.
Is this a good time? So
yes, it is.
I was concerned about the earlier discussion when we were talking about the much higher view. I guess let me just first ask, when there's referencing some of the work papers to company operational forecast data, can you explain exactly what that is?
Melinda, are you referring to something that Travis said or that Mark said?
I was earlier, but I was when I was talking about my concern about the much higher view. That was, I believe, what Travis was speaking of. But my question was actually about the work papers. There's a reference to when you're talking about what the basis for the information is. Let's see, what is the column here? Data sources. Data sources.
Right. Do you have a specific example?
Oh, it's just repeatedly referenced is company operational forecast data.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So again, we're just trying to get clarity on your question. You're asking.
Well, can you just explain that? What does that mean? I mean, I'm just trying to understand first what that means, and then I'll have probably follow-up questions.
Again, since we don't have the work paper loaded, are you able to say which mitigation that's associated with?
I mean, it's literally on every single one.
And I just wanted to make sure that the right team is on the call. That's all.
Oh, it's the high pressure. It's high pressure. Did you hear me?
I do, yes. Travis, are you able to help Melinda out with when we reference internal forecasting data as a data source for a high pressure mitigation?
I don't think so.
No, sorry, yeah.
I had a hard time hearing it first, and then she came in clear, and then I don't know that this is, I'm not 100% sure that this is an integrity management question, Joe.
Okay.
So
yeah, that's why I was trying to find out what mitigation she was referring to. Melinda, if you're looking at a work paper, if you can just tell us what the ID number is and the name of the mitigation.
I'm not actually looking at a specific mitigation. I'm looking at the numerous times that company operational forecast data is referenced. So it's there's no need to identify a specific ID.
All right. Again, if we knew what you were looking at.
So on all, I'm looking at the document entitled Risk Assessment and Mitigation Phase, Chapter SCG, Risk 1, QWP, Incident Related to the High Pressure System, excluding digging, work papers, May 17, 2021. Data sources.
All right, we're just trying to catch up to you, that's all.
Okay.
Again, I'm just going to try to find, I think you referenced the work paper that we have on our RAMP website.
I don't know where I downloaded it from. I'm assuming it was either the website or the commission's website.
All right, so again, I'm just going to, SoCalGas work paper for high pressure. The one that ends in QWP.
Okay, I'll go back. Yes.
All right. And what page?
All I'm trying to do here is understand the data sources. So as you know, or should know, the commission decisions require that the utilities identify their data sources. And one of the data sources that's identified is company operational forecast data.
All right, I think I caught up to you. Just a second. Let me figure out how to share my screen again. Share.
Yeah, Joe, I
Thanks.
see what she's speaking about in the QWP work paper.
Can you guys see that? Is it
last 3 pages or so of that? Yeah, starting on page 10, you're there.
Yep. All right. So again, just for the SoCalGas team, this is the quant work paper for high pressure chapter, and where we summarized the data. And over on the right-hand side, we identified data sources. And so I think, to the extent we have company operational forecast data, Melinda's asking if we can provide any clarity on those. And so since we have the integrity management team here, if I just jump down here to 21, which would be the TIMP, and we look at sources of data, we identified 4 different sources of data. And I think this is a summary of sources of data. There could have been 1, there could have been 5 sources of data that's, company operational forecast. Yeah. And so again, to the extent anyone on the call, and I can go look for another work paper that may have the specific data source that's referenced as company operational, and I will do that, but is anyone able to provide some insights as to what this may reference?
Joe, this is Jeff Bunting. Basically, this we also sort of have to understand the timeline. So when we first initiated our provision of the work papers, we gave it at a higher level we called tier 1. So this is just giving you a breakdown of what that data is. And so once we provided our supplemental work papers and they had the more detailed justifications, this is essentially just a rolled up view of all of that. So when we say something like company operational data, we're just talking about our scope, how much work we think we're going to do, which all went into the RSCs. And same thing with costing. And then 10 years of historical PHMSA data. We talked about how we use PHMSA data to build the risk score. So this is really just a rolled up view of all the rest of the data that we ended up providing.
And Melinda, I don't want to cut you off, but I think if you look at the other work papers that we provided, the spreadsheets that then have the data point by data point by data point, and then each data point has the identified data source, I think that may be the best place to look to see what are the specific data points for specific data sources for specific data points.
But this is Tom from Turn. I will note that there was a data request response that where we were basically asking for additional work papers, and so I consider the response to be additional work papers. It's the response to Turn data request 8 question, and the one that relates to the high pressure system, for example, is 2.3, question 2.3. But these work papers, to prevent the struggles that Melinda and others are going through, who should just be able to go to the SEMPRA website and find the work papers, can be obviated if SEMPRA will just make its workshop, its website look like it did for the wildfire mitigation plan, and put the work papers and the Excel responses to the data requests up on the website. And I know I've raised this many times. It's astounding to me that it's still not happened, but it's just going to make the process very hard for people when they write comments to talk about what they're referring to. If we have them all located in one place, it will make our lives enormously easier and enable parties to more easily participate in this proceeding, which I hope should be a goal.
I appreciate you bringing that up, and yes, it is definitely a goal. When we are actively preparing, developing that type of site for our GRC. So when we have responses to data requests that have attachments, parties will be able to go to that site as part of the GRC. We don't have that platform, if you will, ready yet for RAMP. So what we are doing, we have provided every party the spreadsheets, the work papers that we referenced. If to the extent you requested a work paper and we provided that work paper to you, we have provided them to all the other parties. At this time, we have a company policy that precludes us from posting attachments to the ramp website. We are aware of the situation you referenced over on the wildfire mitigation plan website, and that's we consider that to be a different situation than with ramp. And as we said, we recognize potential inconveniences, and we've initiated a policy internal that within 1 business day, whenever we issue a response to a data request that has an attachment, all parties will be receiving that a courtesy copy of that email with the narrative and with the attachment.
So what then am I supposed to cite to that I know everybody can look at when I'm writing my comments? When I want to cite to the response to data request 8Q2-3 and talk about row such and such and line such and such, I think I would like to provide the link to the website where it can be found, but that does not exist.
You're correct. It does not exist. You can just reference that attachment in that row, and everybody will have a copy of what you're referring to.
Yeah, I think that's really, really unhelpful too. I mean, I want the people I want the advisors and the commissioners' offices to be able to do that, and they haven't been on these service lists. I want people to be able to see what I'm talking about just by reading my document and not have to have organized their own way of keeping all these documents accessible. It's not, you're burdening the system and have yet to provide a good reason for it, other than some unexplained operational limitations at the utility that didn't apply in the wildfire mitigation plan context.
We will provide the response in written. It is not an operational constraint; it's a company policy constraint, and we'll provide that in writing to you.
Well, company policy sure sounds to me like an edict from on high that is arbitrary and unexplained.
So on these, in response to Turn's data request 8, do the work papers, so that I didn't pull them up, but do they distinguish between when you're talking about company operational forecast data versus SME input?
Yes, this is Jeff. Yes, when you look at the more detailed explanations, it tells you what the data is that are driving the numbers.
Will I be able to see like what you meant by your company operational forecast data when I look at those work papers? I mean, data request response?
You will be able to tell exactly where the numbers we provided came from by what is in the explanation. So,
but I won't be able to tell how you're distinguishing as the information that was relied upon. For what I'm trying to understand is what the subject matter expert input relied upon versus the company operational forecast data, and where the line is drawn, why there's two separate categories here.
you will be able to tell what is SME input, and if there's another data source for it outside of SME input, you will be able to tell that in the supplemental work papers. This here is just a listing for each mitigation at a high level where we pulled the data, and then the supplemental gives you exactly where the data came from.
Okay, so is this obsolete, or is this just more general?
It is more general.
Okay. Because what I was hearing before when Travis was speaking was that SoCalGas is looking at the ramp as a much higher view than its integrity management program. And the ramp should really be including all the data that you have looked at in the, it shouldn't be once removed, it should be drilling down. In other words, how do you ensure that you aren't just taking generalized information about anything, using the example from earlier, seam type? How do you ensure that you're actually using the information on the particular pipe that you're recommending a mitigation for when you just make a generalization about seam type. In other words, all seam type X causes Y. But then you know, because you've just done an actual inspection, whether Y is in fact happening on this pipe. And what I'm hearing from the conversation earlier is that the information that you know about the pipe is not being utilized in the ramp because it's a higher view.
I think the one thing I want to caveat to what you said, and this is mentioned in the August 11th workshop as well as a little bit here, all of this data and all of this work internally and for the ramp and our models all goes into creating this filing. So it's not that we're ignoring those things. Our internal models are showing us what we need to do. As Travis articulated, it's showing us, you know, what's out there. The ramp is the showing of, hey, this is the programs that we're putting forth in the mitigation. So I just want to say that we're not ignoring that information. That information is there, and we're using it to build out our programs and the work we plan to do over the next year or two cycle.
How do you ensure that you're using the actual information about the pipe to come up with a mitigation? It sounds to me and it looks to me like you're using generalized information. At least it's being the general information is being given significant weight. And I guess maybe that's my question. How much weight is given to general information about a particular seam type versus the actual data that you have on the pipe itself?
I don't know if we can explicitly say, well, you know, the amount of work we're forecasting X% is based off of seam type or anything. Like, I'm not sure I fully comprehend what you're implying by asking for a breakdown of how much it goes into seam type and things like that.
Well, you are, hold on, sorry. You're saying that you use certain things, certain pieces of information to decide what mitigations to impose. And I'm trying to understand, are you using them all equally, or are some more important than others in terms of coming up with a mitigation? Because that is what this entire proceeding is supposed to be about.
Melinda, can I rephrase the question you just asked it, and maybe this goes with what Chris was asking. Did you just ask, are we using data to prioritize whether we do replace plastic pipe versus steel pipe versus steel pipe with a seam? You know, are you asking if we prioritize between different mitigations?
Am I asking if we? I mean, not. I guess so. We could start there. Are you saying this is a follow-up from what Chris was speaking of earlier?
And again, I don't want to speak on behalf of Chris or Mark, but I think, as they said, each mitigation within DEMP addresses a different risk. And doing one does not, if we do more vintage plastic, the risks still remain for bare steel. And so there are times when it's not, do we do more steel or do we do more plastic? There's not necessarily a trade-off of doing one versus the other. Each is looked at relative to its own risk.
Well, I don't want to get confused between when we were talking about the distribution stuff, but my concern with some of the discussion that was earlier was that it sounded like the result was that the specific information was not being utilized. that the specific pipe, the information that you get through TIMP is not being utilized in the ramp because the ramp is at a higher level, or not that it's not being utilized, but it's that it is not taking it into account in the manner to which it has to be taken into account for under TIMP.
All right, and maybe just for clarity, if you were to, submit us your question, written down, and so then that way we can all make sure.
This is already a requirement. In the last ramp process, one of the comments that we made was that that you have to use utility-specific data in order to determine the mitigation to use. And what I was hearing earlier suggesting that that's not being, if it's being used at all, it's not being given very much weight.
Okay, again, so that you're making a comment and not so much a question. I just want to make
no,
sure.
I'm just pushing back on the fact that you won't answer now, as opposed to saying I should do a data request when it's already a requirement of the commission that the comments be included. I mean, this is already supposed to have been addressed. So I'm trying to make sure that it has been addressed, and it sounds like it hasn't. I'm asking if it has been addressed. The use of utility-specific data in determining what the mitigations to choose for the high-pressure pipeline. All the information that you get from TIMP that you have, all the information you have with respect to the pipe, each segment of pipe on your system.
Mark or Jeff, I think, again, I'm just trying to help out. You're asking, do we use internal data when we do our analyses? Or are you asking, do we use only 100% of internal data and no external data whatsoever?
I say that again?
Melinda, I'm just trying to understand your question. If you're asking, do we use internal data when we do we use internal gathered data when we do our analysis? Or are you asking, do we use only 100% internal data and no external data? Because I heard you saying two different things.
I mean, I don't understand why this is so difficult.
So this is Elliot, and I defer to Jeff or some of the others on the team on some of this. But on the whole, we used internal data where we had it and where it was appropriate in measuring and conducting and calculating the RSEs. And if there were times when industry data might have been more appropriate, or data from another utilities incident, for example, then we would use that. But we do have utility and SoCalGas and SDG&E specific data that we've used, and it should be explained in the work papers. It should indicate on the supplemental work papers where that is. So if there's a specific one, I think we're just a little confused going between the general and the specific here. If there's a specific one you have a question about, Melinda, we can answer.
You guys, do you have an explanation somewhere about how it is determined when something is quote unquote appropriate?
That's a good question, and like I said, I can't answer that just in the general and in the abstract. We used, if you want to ask about a specific one, and that's one of the purposes of these workshops.
Well, I'm trying not to get into the detail. I have to understand the process before I can get into the questions about the details. I'm trying to understand the analysis, which again is what this proceeding is about. Is how does SoCalGas make risk assessment decisions?
Mm-hmm.
And you're starting to explain it to me, and I'm trying to determine how you determine when industry data is more appropriate, and is that explained somewhere? Because I can tell you I haven't seen it. Now, obviously, I haven't read every single data response request response. So maybe it is somewhere, and you can just tell me where the explanation is about how the determination is made when industry data is more appropriate than when internal data is used. Because it would seem to me, and common sense that when you have specific information about the actual pipeline that you're talking about, it should be valued to a much greater extent than just generalized information from somewhere else in the nation. And secondly, if you're including both analyses, what is the, do the SMEs use the nationwide data that may or may not have something to do with a pipe and give it significant weight when you actually are faced with detailed information about the pipe itself?
So Melinda, this is Jeff. Maybe I can add a little more clarity or color. So when we looked at scoring risks and how we think mitigations impacted risk, we looked at what data we had available and which data we thought characterized the risk more appropriately. As I mentioned in the past, SoCalGas doesn't have any compressor incidences, but we still wanted to capture that. So in that instance, we use national data for compressors because that data was available. Some of the other ones where there was some SoCalGas data, but we went to industry data was because the data set was super small compared to what's available nationally. Now, do we explicitly go for each risk? Well, this is why we used this and this is why we didn't? No, but the overarching principle was what data set we think characterizes the risk more accurately and is more appropriately applied to SoCalGas, and then we provided those sources appropriately in the risk work papers.
So when you're talking about a particular aspect of a pipe, and you have specific information about that pipe, how do you ever determine that you should use the general data when you have the specific data?
I think there might be.
It sounds like that's what you were saying earlier. That's what was being said earlier.
I think there might be something that we're kind of glossing over here, and I just want to make clear is we use when we're deciding work and when we're showing the ramp, we use both processes to inform our decisions about what work to execute and what we should be doing. So as I mentioned before, these processes are complementary. What TIMP and DIMP and SIMP all use to build their prioritization and things, that's all important. What they use their data to build out the programs they have, and we showcase those programs in the ramp showing. So your point is we are taking into all that data into consideration. It's just the presentation and ramp isn't as in that granular dreams sort of way.
Well, because when I hear that you're taking it into consideration, I'm trying to understand in what manner, how are the different pieces of information being utilized in determining what mitigation to propose. You're saying you're using it's complementary, but in what way is it complementary?
So
are you saying that so if you know that a certain characteristic of a pipe causes a certain potential problem in nationwide data, but you also know that the particular pipe on the SoCalGas system has been checked as recently as 1 month before the ramp filing and has been determined not to have any of the problems that the national data would suggest could occur. How is that information assessed? How do you assess that? How do you use that type of hypothetical in determining what mitigations to propose? Because it kind of seems to me like you're just using the national data to propose, just goes back to one of Tom's earlier questions, about the fact that it seems like you're kind of just proposing the most you can do rather than what's actually necessary.
Melinda, I'm going to try to paraphrase. When you say, how do we use the data to determine what mitigations we propose? We use the data to determine what segments within a mitigation to do work on. The mitigation itself, if you will, the TIMP, the 4 different type of TIMP related mitigations. Each of those is based upon 4 different risk assessments, 4 different risk concerns we have. So the mitigation is based upon riser risks associated with risers, risks associated with the bare steel, risks associated with the vintage plastic. Those are the mitigations. We then use data to determine which sections of the plastic, which sections of the bare steel we then actually do the work on.
Okay, so the mitigation is proposed before the utility-specific data is part of the equation.
If you're asking the scope of the mitigation, again, the mitigation, there are safety concerns, there are compliance requirements. There are compliance requirements for us to replace plastic pipe. There are compliance requirements for us to replace, transmission pipe. So those are requirements, and we need to have mitigations to meet those compliance requirements to address identified risks. Then there's a question of, all right, which part of the pipe, which sections of the pipe do we do? What are the, and so that was part of the more granular discussion of, with the DREAMS model, there is a lot of data that's used to determine what sections of pipe
I think you're going back to the DIMP discussion. I think you're mushing the two together, but it's fine. I don't think that I'm getting the clarification I was hoping for. So it is what it is. It sounds like you have not complied with the decision on the 2019 ramp.
Are there any other questions from other parties? I know I'm looking at it's a little after 3 o'clock. There were 2 questions that were asked in previous workshops I did want to give an answer to during today's call, but certainly that won't take much time at all. Are there any other questions specific to this topic?
Have these webinars been recorded, or whatever this is called, workshop?
Yes,
Correct?
yeah, all the
I think so.
workshops are recorded. They're posted to the RASA page of the Safety Policy Division page on the CPUC website, which the easiest way to find it would just be start typing in the search bar what you're looking for. Our website's been redesigned recently and it may be challenging. I apologize for that. But they're on our site, on our page.
Thank you very much.
This is Laura Earle with SCG&E. Melinda, I think that it might be helpful. I know that our team has tried really hard to answer the question that you've asked today. I think it might be helpful if we were able to see those questions in writing. I think sometimes that really helps to solidify what it is that's being asked, and it gives us a chance to digest it and ask any follow-up questions if we need to for answering the question. So I think that might be helpful for both of us. You could do that.
Joe, if you'll bear with me, I know we're a little bit past time. What I'd like to recap what I understand is the process in the case of something like the vintage pipe replacement program. In the first place, you have a regulatory requirement to do an integrity management program. And in the course of doing your integrity management program, you identify elements of your pipeline that you find have a higher level of risk. And so, the integrity management program just basically says, once you've found something that has a higher level of risk, you should remove that risk from your system. And in many cases, removing the risk would best be done by a full pipeline replacement. Maybe there's other ways you could mitigate a particular risk, but having done that, you basically come up with, hey, there is a bunch of pipe in our system that integrity management says we need to replace. it's incumbent on us by regulation to address that as expeditiously as we can. So how much can we do in a year? What's our maximum feasible rate? It's going to be so many 100 miles a year. That is what we want the commission to understand in a GRC filing, that for regulatory purposes, for compliance purposes, we need to replace this many miles, and that's the most that we can do. And here's the cost. So that's what's really driving. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is kind of how I understand the process at this point. So that's what's driving the number of miles that are proposed, which is basically the scope of what's planned to be done in the next period of time. Then once you've come up with that number, hey, this is a program we need to do, RAMP is asking you to present a risk spending efficiency for that activity. So you go back in and say, well, how do we analyze what the actual risk reduction to our global pipeline system will be from doing that? And you analyze that using a different set of data, looking at risk to your pipeline system as a whole, rather than trying to build it up from the data that was used to determine individual segments to be replaced. You've already done that. You've picked out a set of segments. You've identified the miles of those that you can do. Now you're trying to figure out, well, what's our risk score reduction from doing that activity? And you actually approach it from the top-down level, which is, whether it's right or wrong, that's how you've chosen to approach ramp risks. You look at the system level, kind of high-level risk, and you go into your calculation tables and you apply, to the degree you have it, your own company data about incidents, your own company data about consequences should one of those incidents occur. You come up with a lore and a core from really a different set of data than the data that was used to develop, say, your integrity management program. So there's definitely, I think, two different sets of data involved here. And I think what parties would like to do in the rate case, and what they'd like to see from the ramp, is whether there's any flexibility in your decision to mitigate X number of miles. Is there some kind of break point? You're proposing to do 100 miles a year. Can you give us some confidence that all of those miles are at the same level of risk? Or would maybe a portion of those miles get you a much greater amount of risk reduction than the rest of those miles? If you're just presenting, hey, we need to do all of these miles, parties have no visibility into, is there some kind of sensitivity? Is there some kind of leeway? Could the commission decide that you shouldn't mitigate all of the miles being proposed as a cost-saving measure? But so far, with the presentation in the ramp, all we have is just that the utility needs to do all of these miles because of regulatory requirements. And we didn't go to a breakdown of what the level of risk is within those miles, because from our point of view, the utility, it all has to be done. So that's kind of how I understand the process and what you presented in the ramp. Is that pretty much jibe with what the utility is presented? I know there's a lot of words.
No, I just wanted to make sure that I'm the right person to respond. Again, I'm trying to take my role as case manager and then my overall understanding. But I think from what I'm seeing, yes, that is correct. And my understanding also with regards to ramp to GRC integration is that one of the reasons for these workshops is to listen to this feedback, and then when we do the GRC, to reflect this input, reflect this feedback, and then to identify where and how we've incorporated this level of feedback. So I want to just make sure that you're identifying some issues and some concerns that folks have and some questions that folks have, and again, trying to provide an answer as to, I certainly have it written down, and to the extent as part of as I said, the ramp to GRC integration, these are the exact type of topics that we will be identifying within the GRC and identifying where, how, if, where, how, why not. We will be, addressing, reflecting answers to these questions and these desires.
Yeah, this is Travis. I thought I would jump in here. Maybe just to say two things quickly. First, Fred, right? That's who's speaking.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think that was very well stated and very clear. So that makes me happy. I think I feel like that was a good reflection of how the process works when you described and characterized during the first half of your statement, just from a high level how this whole process works. And then secondly, I think your statements about needing to address and help to clarify these concepts of I think maybe the easiest way to say that these concepts of diminishing returns and when does the level of effort when does the level of return reduce to the point where we're at a break-even stage and there doesn't need to be any more action taken. I think we've heard you loud and clear, and I think that's helpful for our team. I would say, generally speaking, I think we agree with you, and I think that was well stated and good feedback. So I just wanted to formally respond that I think on the whole, we're in agreement.
Good to hear. I'm glad I seem to be on the wavelength of understanding of what the process has been.
But this is Tom. Some of your comments, Fred, triggered a question from me. I'm not going to speak for you, Fred, but and maybe I'm misunderstanding what you said, but I hadn't heard the Sempra utilities say that, and let's go to the vintage plastic program. We were discussing that their plan is to do 100 miles per year. I hadn't heard them say that if they don't do the 100 miles, which they say that they're capable of doing, if they do less than 100 miles, that they will be in violation of TIMP regulations or other applicable law. Is that what you're? Is that seemed to be?
I'm assuming that that's the case at
no,
this
no,
point.
I would like to hear that
what they
separate. You were stating it, but I want to hear from them. Is that their argument that they are obliged to do every single mile they can, or are they saying something different?
Travis, is that one you can answer?
Yeah, the DIMP, this is Mark, sorry. Yeah, through the DIMP regulations, we're required to collect data, system knowledge, assess our system, identify our threats, prioritize, and then we're required to address risk on the system and then continue to monitor, continuous monitoring, right? So ultimately, replace all the pipe. We're not saying replace all the pipe. We're saying we're going to identify the risk. We're going to generate a program to address that risk, and we're going to monitor. And we're going to see whether or not we get to a point where we don't need to do that mitigation anymore. But that has yet to come, and leave it at that.
Yeah, but
are you asking, is there a mile per year compliance requirement in essence?
Well, again, as it was sort of translated by Fred a moment ago, it was almost as if Fred was translating Sempra's argument into Sempra is obligated to do every single mile it is capable of. That's the obligation, that there is somehow a legal obligation, and that if Sempra were to do anything less than every mile it's capable of, it would be in violation of the law. And I don't think that's the way it works. I think there is flexibility. I think the TIMP regulations are not nearly that prescriptive. They do require the assessment and the prioritization of addressing threats, but they leave a fair amount of discretion into how much work should be done. And I think they leave a fair amount of discretion with this commission and how much work should be approved. And I think that's consistent with previous commission decisions.
Yeah, I guess just to piggyback on this a little bit, some is discretionary and some is not. There are definitely some conditions that are simply mandated, and you know, the integrity management programs are compliance programs. So I think there's maybe the answer to your maybe the response to your statement is I think it depends. Some of these actions are locked down and there's really not a lot of discretion to be had. Others, I think, you know, you could have a debate about how much is enough. And I think at the moment, going back to what Mark was saying, we're mandated to follow certain aspects of the distribution integrity management program. And that's precisely what the team does. We follow the regulations. We comply with the mandates. And by the nature of risk assessment, there is a feedback loop and there is a refreshing and an updating that does occur, right? There's a loop to this process. And so I do think maybe a different way to look at this is I don't think we're quite all the way down the road yet, right? We're sort of midway. We've embarked on work to mitigate some of these known threats. And we're halfway through. I think we can easily state we're certainly not to the end of the road. And I would imagine as we learn more, as the systems mature, as we get better at risk assessment, and as we approach the endpoint, as we continually, as we continue to mitigate more and more of the threat, I would imagine we would see a reduction in risk. And at some point, in theory, yeah, that risk should reduce to a level that's acceptable or tolerable. But as a broad statement, I don't think we're there yet. We're midway through.
Thanks, Travis.
Thank you, and thank you, Tom, for helping clarify that point.
Any other questions for the integrity management team? If not, there's just two questions that were asked during previous workshops I did want to provide an answer to. I think it was during the EII workshop. We had a discussion on the column header that was percent change in lore, and the question Tom asked for confirmation if the values under that header, which is percent change in lore with an L, could also include percent change in core, because there was not a unique separate column for percent change in core. And yes, the answer is yes. We do confirm that there, in those instances where there is a change in core, that impact is included in that percent change in lore value. So we do confirm that. And then the other, I believe it was a question, Tom, when we were talking about EII, Tom had asked if there could be some double counting between the EII risk chapter and the wildfire risk chapter with regards to, I believe it was values in lore, the likelihood of, in this case, the faults occurring. And we believe the answer is no, based upon our research. We believe that to the extent there were faults in the high fire threat district, they were subtracted from, if you will, the faults that were used for the EII analysis. So faults in the high fire threat district are only used for the wildfire lore and not for the EII lore. I think that was the topic that Tom had mentioned there may be some double counting on. So we just wanted to provide some clarity on those two during this workshop.
Could I follow up?
Yes, to the extent I'll answer as best as I can. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So the work paper we were looking at that was showing percent change in lore, you've acknowledged it did include core changes. Are you going to redo the work paper so that we have one that actually shows how the core values changed?
We were not planning on it. That's, again, we can take that as a lessons learned request and reflect those in the work paper going forward. when we do the work paper for the GRC.
I guess it's your, I mean, I can't, I certainly can't force you to do a revised work paper, but you have what sounds like an inaccurate work paper now. So you're going to choose not to correct your work paper. So be it.
Well, I'm just saying, okay, I should not have answered so quickly. We'll take that request in-house and we will get back to you on that. As we did say, the impact on the RSEs is unaffected, but yes, to the extent you'd like to know the impact on the core value itself, understood, and we will follow up on that request.
And then the double counting point, how can I confirm through the work papers that what you're saying is accurate?
The events, I think for the lower, the number of events, which I think on the distribution line was 1632. I'm just going off the top of my head. That number, I mean, if you want us to provide submit a data request and we'll provide you the numbers, I'm telling you that that number excludes the number of faults that happen in the high fire threat district. That's what we did.
What was 1632? What number is that?
I think it's the number of events in the for distribution.
And was that for EII or for that?
That's EII. Distribution EII.
Hang on just a second. I'm just trying to catch up on note taking. 1632 events for the lower for.
If you look in the one work paper that has the RSE in the name.
That's okay. So you're saying those 1632 events, I can just see that those are non.
You can't see. You ask for clarity, and we are providing you clarity.
And so the assertion, I guess, what it is an assertion that those 1632 events do not include any what?
Faults that occurred in the high fire threat district.
Okay, thank you. Okay, in the sense of
understood.
I understand your response, not that I find it completely unacceptable. Right, yeah, right, yeah.
Yes. Again, when Christian was having his discussion, he mentioned that for EII purposes, it's faults outside of the high fire threat district, and so it was the follow up to that. Any other questions?
This is Chris. So this is kind of like the wrap up here now. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you. So there's a couple things I was saving for this last wrap up and if we could, I don't know if you have it or I could pull it up, would be our additional technical working group meeting comments that we had given prior to the other workshops. And we covered a lot of the last ones I think were saved for today's workshop. But I wanted to bring that up, and I could either bring it off of mine unless you have it handy.
It might be easier for you to pull it up.
Okay, let me do that. If I can get the right one here. Seen it yet?
I see it.
Oh, do you see it?
So, I do, yeah.
Okay. And this should show like B wildfire topics. Do you see that?
Yeah, I do,
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. And then let me, I'll make it bigger on my screen. So I'm going to use this as kind of like a talking point because we went over this and we got a lot of good information from SDG&E and then walking us through the spreadsheets. I think they took us to one table. We could see, for example, if we wanted to figure out the cost. So one of the bullets here, average and range of cost per mile, they pulled up, SDG&E, Sarah, and folks pulled up a spreadsheet. They took us to a table and they said, well, this is the cost for this particular program. And then they also said, and over on this table here, you can see the number of miles. And so what we were looking for with this topic list was kind of like this kind of a summary. I think that this would be invaluable for us and maybe the commission, other parties, to have this kind of summary information, because this is really informative to kind of understand the mitigations programs that are being proposed, and allows us to be able to compare the mitigation program compared to other mitigation program, to be able to compare it maybe across utilities, and then to be able to have a much more better understanding of what is being proposed in a ramp. So, and so this upper graphic, we stole that, and I think they mentioned it from SDG&E, gave it before commissioners. And so if we had this information, so instead of us, pulling out, okay, it's row 5 of column L, where we find this this figure, and then you take that and you divide it among row 6, column 7. I'm just making these things up, and then you can kind of come out with this number. What would be, I think, really helpful would be to have this summary very upfront, as part of the ramp. So we didn't get like this. I mean, they walked us through, and I was trying to shuffle between spreadsheets during that workshop, but I'd have to go back still and try to piecemeal this together to really understand it. And then it would be sort of my best kind of navigation of those values to make, not entirely sure I understand them, but maybe I understand them better than I did. But if this information were front and center in the application, and maybe even a supplement, I think that this would really help inform us, and then we could then, and then the commission, and then the decision makers, to understand how this all fits. So if we knew, for example, the cost of these different mitigations, and a topic that we've raised before is in proceedings, is to understand the big picture. So at this point, we were talking earlier about, this kind of concept applies across not just this wildfire mitigation of certain 600 segments, but it applies to, for example, the vintage pipe program. So I don't really at this point have, like, off the top of my head, like, okay, this is the number of miles of vintage pipe that is going to be maybe plastic pipe, or broken down by plastic pipe or other types of vintage pipe, to understand how many miles are here, what is the cost per mile, what is the RSC for that, and then to understand the context. What number of miles were previously put in mitigated, what are the number of miles that are in the forecast, and then we would expect to see in the general rate case, and then how many miles are left to be mitigated. And those were kind of questions we were asking on the fly during the last workshop for this wildfire stuff. But it would be useful to have this for all, especially the larger mitigation programs, the higher cost mitigation programs, so that is really succinctly condensed and available. Everyone understands this is what is being brought forward in the mitigation plan. And that way we understand what those costs are, what the RSCs are, what's the big picture. And that way we can then be able to understand, okay, does this make sense from what we understand? And then we can provide comments on that. So I really believe this is key information that is very, it was difficult. I mean, they walked us through, but I still don't feel comfortable with what I was learning from the last workshop. on that one topic, but I think that this information would be extremely valuable to a lot of people. And then also understand, you know, put this in context not only of what happened and what's before us and what will remain at the end, but also the context of how have these targets been met in the past. So for example, on this document here, it talks about 82 miles of covered conductor, and having it broken down by year would be useful, because at the workshop I learned that covered conductor, I guess that's kind of a new program, and only 5 miles have been done to this date and time where we are right now. But having that information understood and disclosed, I think would be really useful, so that we understand, okay, we're going from 5, and then we're going to ramp up to what in 2021? I'm sorry, we're at 5 at a point in 2021. And now what will it be in 2022? How many miles are expected over? I would actually say if it were broken down by year, it would be much more explicit in terms of what the plan is. And then understanding, okay, this is a target at this point in time in this ramp. How were those targets met in the past? So when I mentioned context, having that information from the past would then be able to give us more comfort. So when a target was set in the past, be it in a past GRC or a past ramp, were those targets realistic? Were they achievable? Were they achieved? That gives a much greater confidence level, I think, for folks who are trying to digest the ramp as to whether or not this is, whether this target is reasonable, achievable, so that, it's just more information. I think it's critical information and useful information. So, and so I just wanted to bring that up as, like, if this information were in the ramp, or if it could be provided as a supplement, I think that summary information is extremely valuable. It would be extremely valuable to us. And I think that it would be a generally useful tool across multiple mitigations. So back again to the, vintage plastic pipe, you have how many miles or hundreds of miles are you planning to do now? How many thousands of miles has to be done, or does the utility say needs to be done, so that we understand, well, this is a big cost item, and we're only addressing this number of miles. So, so that we understand when that is put forward and that is considered in a rate case, that, that's a lot of money potentially. But we're going to be spending that amount of money for how many years, So since the topic for the agenda also talked about TBD and stuff, I think this is a big thing that would be really invaluable, that I hope could come out of this ramp, that we would be very interested in this kind of information. And also, I think it's been mentioned already, but the topic that we and others have talked about is, I understand, like in the temp and the DIMP, there's this accounting aspect that's been presented. Well, this is the number of miles. We went and we looked at, this. We figured out the RSC, and this is the RSC. And we need to do this maybe because of federal requirements for the temp. But what's not clear is how this level of miles was picked, instead of half that number of miles or double that number of miles, or this level of funding for some temp program was selected versus some other level. So, and I understand it was in general terms that it was explained, well, we use this process, but when it comes down to numbers, it would be useful to understand, well, how come this very specific set of numbers and not some other very specific set of numbers? And that I didn't come away from this really having a real good understanding of why the specific numbers were set. So those are kind of like the TBDs or the comments. And also maybe if there were an opportunity to get that supplemental information in the course of this ramp proceeding, I think that would be, we would really appreciate that additional information. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Definitely appreciate the feedback. I'm glad it's recorded, so I can go back and make sure my notes are correct.
And since the recording is still running, I'll just slip down to number 4, which I know, I think you can still see this, but we really didn't get a chance to talk about this, to discuss the relative risks, cost reduction in RSCs for different PSPS mitigations. I kind of understand the PSPS. I think our team kind of understands some of the basic generalities of PSPS. I mean, we talked about switches and technology that was in the last workshop. But it would be nice if this were actually presented in that same kind of format. These are the PSPS mitigations. This is, this is one form. This is another form. I think they even mentioned that, I think SDG&E is kind of determined or decided that rough coal is not suitable, or it ends up being too expensive because of the configuration of the system. SDG&E is looking into, I think, the TING system, but I don't really have an understanding of, okay, when you look at these mitigations and then you can add switches, how those will impact PSPS and what are the trade-offs between those mitigations. Having that will then, I think, really be useful in understanding what are the most effective, what is SDG&E's plan for those, and then what are the trade-offs with those different mitigations. Because as far as I can tell, SDG&E and many of the utilities are going to be using PSPS for many years to mitigate wildfires. And so that's an extreme impact on customers, and it's going to be enduring for a long time, and it has significant risk and impacts on, we mentioned it before, you have customers, you have classes of customers, you have critical infrastructure customers, you have communications that's powered by, cell phone towers and stuff. So having those really detailed in terms of the trade-offs, the cost benefits, the number of units of these things that are going to be implemented, I think that would be really useful. So if there were a supplement, having more details about number 4 in there would be, I think, very much appreciated to be able to understand things. So anyway, but I'll leave it at that for the second time. So thanks.
All right, appreciate it. Anyone else? If not, Fred, any final thoughts?
No, I'm hoping we're still being recorded. I haven't got the message that the recording stopped, so hopefully we're all still good and everything's online.
I hope so. I ran out of ink. I hope so. I hope we're recorded. So, all right. Appreciate everyone. This workshop, previous workshops, all very helpful. As I said, from feedback, lessons learned, ramp to JRC integration. We're doing our best to capture comments, suggestions. Certainly, the things Chris has mentioned, topics other stakeholders have mentioned, this one and previous workshops. We appreciate all the feedback, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.
Yep.
Thank you.